We're delighted to welcome you to this session of the 15th Jaipur Literature Festival, protected by Dettol, Banega Swast, India. The session is presented by the Hawthornden Trust. It's our pleasure to present Abdulrazak Gurnah, A Life in Stories. Abdulrazak Gurnah in conversation with Alexandra Pringle. Abdulrazak Gurnah fled Zanzibar as a teenager following the revolution of 1964. After facing prolonged poverty and alienation in England, he began to write, and the experience, motivated by the idea of losing your place in the world and understanding his own displacement, gave rise to his first three novels, Memory of Departure, Pilgrims Way, and Dottie. Gurnah was awarded the Nobel Prize in Literature in 2021 for his uncompromising and compassionate penetration of the effects of colonialism and the fate of the refugee in the gulf between cultures and continents. His novels are striking and formidable. They refuse colonialism's erosive histories and stereotypes. They include Paradise, By the Sea, Desertion, and his most recent Afterlives, which examines the German colonial force in East Africa and the lives of Tanganyikans as they work, grieve, and love in the darkening shadow of war. British publishing legend Alexandra Pringle is in conversation with the brilliant Abdulrazak Gurnah, a session on a life in writing. Abdulrazak Gurnah is the author of 10 novels, including Paradise, Admiring Silence, By the Sea, Desertion, The Last Gift, Gravel Heart, and Afterlives, which was shortlisted for the Nobel Prize for Fiction 2021 and longlisted for the Walter Scott Prize. He was Professor of English at the University of Kent and a Man Booker Prize judge in 2016. Alexandra Pringle was the editor-in-chief of Bloomsbury Publishing for 20 years and is now an executive publisher. Her authors include Margaret Atwood, Esther Freud, Elizabeth Gilbert, Abdulrazak Gurnah, Khaled Hosseini, Jhumpa Lahiri, Madeline Miller, Colin McCann, Kamila Shamsi, and Patti Smith, among others. She's a patron of Index on Censorship, a trustee of the charity Reprieve, and an honorary fellow of the Royal Society of Literature. She's been awarded honorary degrees of Doctor of Letters from Anglia Ruskin University and Warwick University. Please feel free to send in your comments by typing them in the comment section. Do follow our social media handles to get notifications of the upcoming sessions. Please tweet using hashtag Jaipur Literature Festival 2022 and tag at Jaipur Litfest. Ladies and gentlemen, Abdulrazak Gurnah, A Life in Stories. Abdulrazak Gurnah in conversation with Alexandra Pringle.
Hello. It's hard to describe how great my pleasure is in speaking with Abdulrazak Gurnah today and to be here at the wonderful Jaipur Literature Festival in 2022. So last year, one day in early October, in the morning, coming on for lunchtime, I was at my desk working in a very ordinary way, and suddenly it flashed up on my screen that Abdulrazak had been awarded the 2021 Nobel Prize in Literature. And I have to say, I burst into tears. And I did this partly because I've been Abdulrazak's publisher for 20 years, half of his writing life, and a very big part of my publishing life. But also because he's a writer who, although he has achieved very much acclaim and indeed has been shortlisted and longlisted for the Booker Prize, his work had yet to reach right across the world. And because also I think not only does he write in the most beautiful prose, but he also writes about aspects of human life and experience that are important and that require examination. His work has now found publishers in more than 40 countries, with more to come. Everything could have dreamed for him has come true. So the Nobel citation says, for his uncompromising and compassionate penetration of the effects of colonialism and the fates of the refugee in the gulf between cultures and continents. And certainly his work does examine these very, very important things. But I think that it's broader and it's deeper than that. And in many of his 10 novels, he describes the lives of people who are displaced through various agencies, people for whom the winds of trade and love, adventure, greed, poverty, many things have blown them across countries and continents, people who are deracinated. And I thought we could look at these themes through Abdulrazak's life and work. I want to discover how this little boy from Zanzibar ended up as Professor of English and Post-Colonial Literature at the University of Kent, the author of 10 novels and the winner of the Nobel Prize. So, Abdulrazak, I'd like to begin at the beginning. You were born in you were born in 1948, yeah, in Zanzibar.
That's correct.
Could you describe the world you were born into?
Well, I will in a sec. But first, I want to say just thank you very much for that introduction. Very kind, of course, and also to say that I have found your support for the last 20 years or so very sustaining and, of course, encouraging. Okay, on the day I was born, which I don't remember, but I do remember many things about growing up in Zanzibar. Of course, in fact, it's quite central to my life as a human being as well as an adult. It doesn't ever feel Zanzibar. Doesn't ever feel very far away. Perhaps this is also something that is the curse of a writer, as it were. You rely so much on memory and on remembering, and so on, that maybe some things you wish you couldn't really remember, but they don't go away. So Zanzibar in the 1950s, when I was growing up, seemed seemed all right. You played in the streets mostly. There was a sense of neighborhood, by which I mean, that you knew everybody in the nearby area where you lived. They knew you. The people I grew up with, I didn't know the difference between somebody who was poor or was rich or whatever. It was all everybody together like this. And then school. I really enjoyed school, going to school, which again was not very far away. So that almost everybody at the school, 50% of everybody at the school was somebody who came from the same area as I did. So there was a kind of support group and system going on, which you didn't understand or know about as a child, of course, but you would know, or I would know when my children were growing up here in England and going to school here in England. I knew the difference then between the kind of childhood and schooling I had. But the other interesting thing about being a child was that we lived in an area which was just by the docks. And my father's business was trading with people who came on the seasonal, the monsoon trade, as it were, the musim, as we called it, when the winds change and bring traders from Arabia and India and other further away from, sometimes from the Gulf and even further than that. So he traded with them. He would buy whatever they brought and then kind of sell it to the shopkeepers. So he was a wholesaler, in other words. And this trade had been going on for centuries and centuries and centuries. And so we were right there at this kind of starting point of it when all these people arrived. So in an important way, even as a small child, I knew about the world in a way that, didn't really require geography books or didn't require even maps, really, because it came to us and brought artifacts of various kinds, as well as trade goods and so on, and stories, of course, and cuisines, and etc. Usually, when during that period of Muslim, everywhere would be thronged with smelly, dirty sailors who would sleep everywhere and anywhere, and cause havoc and get into fights and whatever, and all kinds of things. Anyway, so that's the kind of atmosphere I grew up in.
And then in 1964, when you were a young teenager, the revolution happened. So how was that? Yeah.
But I guess just another thing we didn't understand really, or I didn't understand as a child growing into adolescence, I didn't really understand how deep painfully racialized our politics was. There is, as with everybody, I suppose, there is a sort of a certain degree of delusional storytelling about these things, about how peaceful communities are, how they get on with each other, this kind of thing. And I think the revolution was a complete surprise to somebody like me. Perhaps it wasn't to everybody, but I think it was to a lot of people. In other words, the violence is unleashed, and the terror that followed the successful revolt was just incomprehensible. It wasn't something that was there all along. It seemed that all of a sudden we were exposed to something really quite grotesque that we hadn't known was within us. I think something similar to this happened with Uganda and Idi Amin, who actually came afterwards in the very late 60s and early 70s. Uganda seemed such a peaceful, gentle country when I visited as an adolescent, such courteous people. And then you have this. And I think it teaches us something about the capacity for meanness and cruelty also that lurks behind our good stories about ourselves. It was terrifying to actually address your question directly. That is, it was terrifying, that period after the revolution. I mean, in terms of people getting killed and imprisoned, expelled, just degraded and humiliated in all kinds of ways that you could imagine. So that was what it was like.
And so when you were 17, 18, you and your brother decided to leave, and you had to leave illegally. Was there one precipitating thing for your flight, or how did it come about?
People were being forced to leave, not people of my age, but older people were being forced to leave because one of the things that was introduced, as it were, was foreigners, this idea of people who were made foreign in some way by the rhetoric of the revolution. They weren't, but this was part of whoever they didn't want became a foreigner. So there was already a kind of movement going on, movement of people leaving or being forced to leave, or leaving because they were afraid, or because their livelihood was taken away, so they had to go somewhere else to find a livelihood. Say, for example, the Indian community was subjected to this kind of persecution, and most of them left and either went to the mainland or went further to India or indeed elsewhere. So it wasn't a kind of a revolutionary idea, as it were, to say, okay, we're going to go. For us, I think it was, or for me anyway, it was not because I was being threatened in a personal way, but because there was no further studying possible. And I could not see, and of course the climate was terrifying, and the prohibitions were endless. And I was 18. And when you're 18, you think, I'm not staying here, I can't put up with this. I'm going to go off and find something, to do that will fulfill me and make me whatever. So I was in that sort of spirit, that the spirit of kind of reckless kind of adventure, but it wasn't just adventure. It was thinking about the future as well, without realizing the cost.
And education.
Yeah. I mean, not education for any particular reason. It wasn't like I want to be this. That's why I want to do it. It's just you got to do something with yourself. You can't just sort of go around. Yeah, it was things like that. Without, as I say, without really understanding fully what you're abandoning and what you're leaving behind, or indeed what you're going to. It was just this sense of, let's get out of here.
I think you do that beautifully in your first novel, Memory of Departure, which describes the teenage boy Hassan, and he's struggling to be educated, and he is longing to get away from the restrictive government. But he has other things that he wants to get away. He's clearly not you. He wants to get away from a very brutal father, but also the world he inhabits is a very brutal one. But you only see him at the very end. He's on a boat, and you have no idea what's going to happen to him. There must have been a little spirit of the young Abdulrazak in Hassan.
Well, probably more than a little, but it's on the other hand, it's not really a story about, say, my family or something like that.
But that need, that driving need for the young man.
Yes. And in other ways, perhaps too, in that the train journey, which is in the second half of that novel, was one of the most exciting things that I did as an adolescent, or that we did, my brother and I. In the days when you could still travel, it was after the revolution, but you could still travel within the East African nations as well, because in those days there was the East African Economic Community. It was still in existence, and travel was unrestricted between the three East African nations, or four. Anyway, so we took this train journey from Dar es Salaam all the way to Kampala, which took 3 days. Not continuous days, but sort of, and it was just such a memorable, wonderful journey that I just had to write about it in the novel. So things like that were true to my experience, but many of those were things that I observed and, on reflection, was appalled by. Like domestic violence, or like cruelty against children and women, and these ideas, or rather these concerns, have been throughout my writing, I think.
Yes, absolutely. And so, what about your journey to England? What was that like?
That was terrifying, actually, because it was illegal, and at airports was to terrify and to restrict people, that armed soldiers would be kind of patrolling as well, walking around and this kind of thing. And so until the plane actually lifted off the ground, we were sitting there on the plane thinking, at any minute, one of these soldiers is going to come on board and say, "You, get up, out." So that part of it was quite terrifying. And then it was also the first time I was traveling, at least on a long-haul flight. Anyway, I had taken a flight between Zanzibar and Dar es Salaam, which is 20 minutes, that kind of thing, Fokker friendship or something. So it was that as well, that the idea of long-haul travel, so everything was so exciting. So both frightening and exciting at the same time. And even arrival in England, it was an adventure, really, in some ways, in one way. And in another way, also terrifying, because you don't know anything. You don't know what to do or how to go about things. You don't even know whether you're going to be allowed in or not. Oh, it was such a strange time.
And did you know where you were going to end up? Did you know
because we had a cousin who was doing his PhD, and he, poor fellow, was the one that we made direct he's the one we headed for. Which is often what happens, that when people move like this, they go where they know somebody. So he kind of helped us just to kind of settle, at least to find somewhere to live and this kind of thing.
And did you have to combine work with your education? Did you have to stick your life together in difficult ways?
Not immediately. Partly it was because we had, my father had given us a small amount of money. It was actually £400, and said, "Okay, that's it. There's no more. Off you go." And I can't remember what the fees were, but the fees were manageable. It was probably about £100 or less even. And then, lo and behold, we discovered that if you are under 19, that is to say, if you're still in your 18th year, college education was free, even if you're a foreigner. Imagine things like that existing then.
Unbelievable.
So it meant that actually in my first year, I didn't have to pay any fees.
Yeah.
And my brother, I think he only had to pay a sort of a discounted fees or something like that, because he was also only 19. I think by the end of the first year, the money had run out. And of course, then after that point, we had to work in the summers, we had to try and save. And believe it or not, because in a way I found it hard to believe at the time, the landlord of the house we were staying in, throughout the 2 years that we were there, or at least the 18 months we were there, he actually did not take any rent for the last sort of 6 or 7 months or so. He just said, you can pay me. Well, he knew he didn't have any money.
Yeah,
so
but it was kindness. It was real kindness.
So it was either that he would ask us to leave, or he said, all right, you can pay me later when you've got the money. Of course, we never paid him because it was years before we could get the money. But he did it out of kindness. That's literally all.
Yeah.
Anyway, so that was a time, a mixture of surprise, fears, hostility, of course, which I've described elsewhere, but also these unlooked for kindnesses, which.
Yeah. Well, the England you describe in your second novel, in Pilgrims Way, is really grim. It's and I remember it myself, but obviously not from your point of view. You have your young heroes working as a hospital porter and studying night, but it's the incredible, endemic, and absolute racism that he recounts, which is so shocking. And you write it very clearly. It's just laid there on the page. And I imagine this was the England that you encountered.
Yes, it was. It was a great surprise. Of course, it wasn't something we were told about in our education or anything like that. And even when you read about it, like, for example, at that time, of course, we were reading about South Africa. We were reading about what was happening in the United States, civil rights movement, which was then underway in the 1960s, of course. But it didn't associate it with Britain. He didn't think that kind of thing happened in Britain because it was never mentioned, and the newspapers didn't make much of it either. So it was a big surprise to be addressed in certain ways, to be with insolence, with hatred at times. Very little violence, at least to me anyway, very little violence in a personal way, although I know in some parts of the country that was the case. But the part of the country where I was in, you didn't meet violence. What you meant was this hostility, which was low-key, everyday hostility in almost every aspect of life, from going into a shop to boarding a bus to going to school or to college, or anything like that. And it seemed inescapable almost everywhere. Although I have already mentioned that there were also unexpected kindnesses that you met too. But it was very difficult to deal with, which is, I think, as I've said elsewhere, I think this is how I started writing, really, in a serious way anyway.
So that's exactly what I want you to talk about next, which is how you began to write, why you began to write.
Yeah, well, I have as I've said before, that I have always enjoyed writing as an activity from childhood. It just doesn't matter what. The teacher could come in and say, "Here's today, write a story about something boring, like what did you do in your holidays?" And somehow I bend my mind to it, and it would turn out to be something really interesting to me anyway. So I've always enjoyed writing, and I found that during this period that I'm describing, I should also mention that the other problem with that time was a kind of incredible homesickness and kind of loneliness and estranged and that kind of thing. So I found writing about these things in a kind of confessional way, in a kind of way of addressing. I found it helpful. I found it helped me to disentangle things, to understand things. Even, sometimes writing about horrible things like that can actually be quite enjoyable too, in a way. But I found that I was doing this regularly, writing, and that doing so was giving me some relief from confusion and so on. But it took a while before I began to think, so what can I make of this? And to think that I'm going to write something. So I think there's a difference, of course, between writing things down because you want to clarify things for yourself and actually making something which is not about yourself, which is not about. But so what I'm guessing is that that's what making art is all about, rather than crafting something, rather than doing something for purposes of self-reassurance or something like that. So it began like that, but it was a secret. So I couldn't tell anybody about this, or at least I didn't think I could, because the aspiration to becoming a writer seemed such a huge ambition. I thought, no, you can't say that. You make everybody laugh. So I guess for a couple of years, 3 years, when I was kind of writing these various drafts and things, which eventually became Memory Departure after several years, it was all kind of a little hidden thing that I was doing. But anyway, it took a long time, basically, of that process, because probably I did not have, like so many young people can now, say, I'm going to do a creative writing course, and then I'm going to write a novel. So it wasn't like that. I wasn't even convinced that I could do this. So it took a while. And then my lack of conviction was kind of endorsed by the number of rejections that the draft kept receiving as it went
So you kept sending it, to publishers and agents?
Well, I tried agents as well, but neither worked. Neither agent nor publisher worked. And because at that time you could really only send a manuscript, unlike nowadays where you can just make a file and just send that off.
It was expensive and hard work.
And it was expensive, and they took ages to come back, months. So. And then there'll be a little photocopied slip in there to say, sorry.
Oh, no.
and then you have to start again, to first to read through and say, okay, can I make it better or something like that. It was all right. But it took, now, of course, I can say it was all right. At the time, it was very discouraging. But I was also studying, and I was also developing my academic ambition, as it were, thinking I want to become an academic. So I wasn't kind of just sitting waiting for the publishers to reply, as it were. So
weeping
in a way,
into your manuscript.
Yeah. So in a way, I was doing both things. As I was writing, I was doing my academic studying and writing my PhD and working on the novel and so on.
Yes, and you've always had these parallel careers, and that's worked for you. I think it's quite unusual.
Well, it was brilliant for me because I really thought this is what I want to do. At some stage in my early 20s, I thought this is what I would like if possible, this is my ambition, to become an academic and to be a writer as well. And so it's great because it worked out.
But it also worked out because you clearly had the personality that could make that division and attend to one thing and then attend to another without it being a problem for you.
Yes, that's right. I mean, I don't know if, I could do that. It was not a problem. I could comfortably do that throughout my career without feeling like, I know some writers do feel that they have to get away from the academic thing. They have to give it up and become full-time writers. I didn't really want to become a full-time writer. I quite liked the fact that I had this other kind of engagement, as it were, intellectual engagement. And not just because I wanted a salary for security and all that. It wasn't like that, but it was so anyway. It really did mean that I had a relatively secure career as an academic. Yes. And then also always possible to find time to write. Sometimes, and I think back and I think that I managed to get quite a bit of writing done, really.
You did. I think it's absolutely remarkable. It says a lot about your concentration, apart from anything else. But it's a bit like getting published, is the fact that you stuck with it. And then you ended up by being published by the grandest literary publisher in the UK, Jonathan Cave.
Yeah. Yes, and the grandest editor, Liz Golden, who was the one who bought the book.
Yeah, who was my predecessor at Bloomsbury. So it's a lovely sort of theme that goes through. So tell me about your relationship with language and how you came to write in English and what the languages of your childhood were, because you had more than one, didn't you? One was your father's and one was your mother's. So your father spoke Arabic like my grandfather, I think. Yeah.
Right. He spoke Arabic, absolutely. He was very fluent. He certainly was he was probably more fluent in Arabic than in Swahili, because it was his first language and his natural language. My mother couldn't speak Arabic, but she spoke Swahili and grew up in the country. So she was, in the country in the sense of outside of town. And so, in some ways she was deeply embedded as well in her Swahili-ness. In the house, we all spoke in Swahili. Everybody, including my father. And at school, we were also all taught in Swahili until secondary school, and then suddenly you had to switch to English, which did make life a bit difficult. So English was very much a learned language, and not a spoken learned language, but a kind of a studied language in the way that people are taught French in Britain, say. But on the other hand, and this is what happened. I know. So what happened was that, in a peculiar way, I think from around about the age of 8 or 9, I just felt so at ease in English.
Did you?
And it didn't seem strange or a peculiar talent or something like that. I just took it that some of my classmates were good in maths and I was good in English, kind of thing. I just sort of went on like that. Our teacher at the time, at this period of about 9 years old or so, thought differently. He said, no, you've got a real talent. And I think when you're that age, you don't like to be singled out. At least I don't. You're told you're somehow different. And I wanted to say, I'm just the same as everybody else, But it's true. Actually, I met this teacher again because he was a great musician. He's dead now. He was a great musician. In fact, he was the leader of the Tarab Orchestra in Zanzibar, the national orchestra. But he was also a teacher at that time. And when I did meet him just a few years before he died, he said, I discovered you. When you were a child, I discovered you. But in any case, more seriously, to answer your question, so the English came relatively easily to me. That's one reason why I didn't have to think very hard when I was writing. But also I was reading a lot in England when I first came to England. And of course, there's a profound and intimate connection between reading and writing, and that writing is also kind of intertexting all the time, interweaving with what you have read. You speak to other writers and other writings centuries apart, of course, either because you're kind of using something of what they're writing, or sometimes in a quite discrete way. You might be making kind of an overlapping comparison or something like that. In any case, when it came to writing something, to make a decision about writing, I really didn't even think. I just wrote in English because that's what came as well easily to me. Even though I was also an academic of African literature and also debating the issues of language, what other people are doing. But I didn't feel the conflict that so many writers from Africa seem to feel. It seemed to me the choice was mine to make.
So to go forward into your work, your third novel, Dottie, you created a female narrator, which I think is a very interesting thing that you did. And of course, people talk a great deal at the moment about what you can and can't do. But your female characters, I think, always are extremely sensitively portrayed. But did you specifically want to push yourself into new terrain by creating Dottie?
Yes, I did. I was at the time teaching a course about migration. And for me, a lot of it was me learning about migration to Britain. And a lot of it was also, I learned a great deal about that episode or the phenomenon of migration. I mean, migration, excuse me, I suppose 20th century migration rather than anything earlier than that. And in the process of doing this, of teaching this, I read some quite dramatic stories, which have actually not, even now, are not really widely known about experiences of various people. And I suppose I thought, what is missing in all of this is the lives of women. In all of these stories. These stories are almost all of them about experiences of men, one way or another. And so I started thinking about that and thinking, let me see if I can address this in a way. Can I write about this? So that was my attempt. That was why I wanted to write about those two sisters. And also at the time, I was working in London, in Hackney, with an organization that was trying to get young Black people to go back to education, people who kind of flunked school, so people 17, 18, 19, that sort of age, to try and persuade them to, not persuade by rhetoric, but to try and bring them to back to class, as it were, and making sure that they have the qualifications to now join college or all this kind of thing. And in order to do this, we had to interview quite a lot of people to select. We were only allowed to take something like, say, 20 people or something like that. That's what the money, the Social Security would allow. So when we put the ads out, we got several, I don't know how many, I can't remember now, 150, 200 young Black people in the Hackney area came forward. And so we would ask them to say, so what happened? So I heard so many stories of I suppose, of young people failing. And I have to confess, quite a lot of those went into the writing of Dottie, because I just kept picking up all these stories, these experiences of young people. So the combination then of both reading, teaching rather, much later than this, what I've just described, when I was teaching at Kent, then 5 or 6 years later, and finding this absence, if you like, of women's stories of migration, and then thinking back to the other kind of experience 5 years earlier and remembering all of those stories I had heard. And the two things came together along with other things.
And then came what I call your watershed novel, Paradise, because this is your first historical novel. And it was, of course, the one that was shortlisted for the Booker Prize. So what made you go back, first of all, geographically to East Africa and also to that period of history?
First of all, I actually physically went back because it was now possible, because after having left, it wasn't possible to return because you'd broken the law. And then in the mid-1980s, there was a change of government. Well, change of leader, should I say, the government to say, but the change of leader. And one of the things he did, this new leader, was to issue an amnesty for all those people who were left. So it was actually possible to return, which was just as well, because my father died the following year. So it was just as well. So one thing was that, and it brought me back, as it were, to where I was when I was, I suppose, because after all those years in England, I was beginning to kind of resign myself to never being able to go back, and resign myself to actually understanding as much as I could about living in England. Anyway, I went back and I found that, in fact, I hadn't actually gone very far because everything was still fresh. But it made me think about somebody my father's age, who would have been a child when Zanzibar became a British colony, and what that would have felt like. So that was the first impulse, as it were, to say, what would it have been like to actually witness the arrival of these strangers who are now the bosses, as it were. But I was working on Dottie then, I think. So I had to leave that aside and deal with finish writing Dottie. Nothing had been published at that point, of course. I was just quietly working away.
Wow.
At my third novel. But a few years later, when I was then, I had already published Actually, I'd already published the first two, and Dottie was already done and going through the process of being prepared for publication. I was given a sabbatical in my job. Academics have this great thing. They don't call it sabbatical anymore, by the way. They call it study leave now.
Oh, do they?
So sabbatical sounds lazy, like you're allowed to go home and sleep or something like that. So I decided to use my study leave to travel around East Africa, around the coast of East Africa. So I spent 6 weeks just traveling on my own in whichever direction. I had a plan, of course. I wasn't just doing haphazardly. And it was that. When I came back from that, the dust, as it were, had got up into my nostrils, and the sense of place and the stories I kept hearing. And more or less, I kind of immediately sat down and started writing Paradise.
And then Paradise, of course, connects very intimately with your most recent novel, Afterlives. They sort of link into each other. Was that a deliberate thing, or did they just happen to do that like that?
No. It wasn't. It wasn't happen. It was deliberate. I mean, Paradise ends with that recruitment scene, the recruitment drive at just the beginning of the First World War, which incidentally was the first episode that I wrote of Paradise. I mean, and at that point, I was going to write about the war. But I realized that I actually didn't really know enough about the details of the war. And in any case, I was thinking, so how did this young fella, who's now about 17 or 18, how did he get here? And remember, I'd already mentioned that the idea of a child witnessing the beginning of colonialism. So I thought, all right, let me write that backstory kind of thing, if you know what I mean. So that what was the beginning now is the end of the novel. Anyway, so I left him there running after the German recruitment squad. But I think for a while, so that was 1993 or so when I did that, 1994 when Paradise was published. And I did other things, of course, went on to write other books. So other concerns kept coming up. But I think at the back of my mind was also the thought of, so what happened? How would he have coped? What would have happened to somebody like him? Not him necessarily, but someone like him who joined up. Why did they join up? Why did they go and join a colonizing force that was going to end up suppressing their people? And also by this time, I've been doing a lot of other reading. I knew a great deal more about colonialism and so on. I did some more targeted reading in preparation. And so when I started to write it, it just came very nicely because in a way I had been thinking about it for a long time. As I say, I knew quite a lot more than I did in the early 90s when I started to write Paradise. So in a way, it's a kind of absolutely connected to Paradise. But what I wanted to argue, or what I would have argued if somebody had said that to me, is this a sequel? I'd have said, no, it isn't. I'd have said, no, it isn't. But rather is to say that would not have been a unique experience. The experience of the boy in Paradise would not have been a unique experience. Other people also would have gone through similar experiences. And anyway, the center of gravity, as it were, of Afterlives is different from Paradise, where the focus is on the persecution and incomprehension of the child, who, as well as, of course, other things around that. But yeah, they're connected.
Yeah, no, I feel that they work beautifully together. I would love to talk about your other novels, but very sadly, we're out of time. I have so many other questions to ask you, even though we've known each other for so long. So it just remains for me to say thank you so much, Abdulrazak, for this 40-minute conversation. But most of all, thank you for your 10 wonderful novels. We're very lucky to have them in our lives.
Thank you for everything.
Thank you, Abdulrazak Gurnah and Alexandra Pringle, for a fascinating conversation with valuable insights on a life in writing. This session was presented by the Hawthornden Trust. Thank you all for watching and being such a great audience. Please stay logged on to continue to watch with us the series of exciting sessions featuring a stellar list of speakers that have been specially curated for you.